They built a house out of your patience, furnished every room with your hope, and only understood what architecture they had been living inside the day you stopped maintaining it and the walls began quietly to come down. There is a particular moment, not always loud, not always dramatic, sometimes arriving with the quietness of something inevitable, when the avoidant understands that you are gone. Not physically, perhaps. You may still be present in the peripheral spaces of their life, but something in the quality of your presence has changed in a way that cannot be attributed to a mood or a temporary withdrawal or the ordinary fluctuations of a person navigating their own interior life. Something fundamental has shifted. The orientation that you carried toward them, that particular attentiveness, that patient availability, that quality of someone who had not yet stopped hoping, is absent in a way that the avoidant's finely calibrated nervous system registers immediately, even before their conscious mind has caught up with what they are sensing. You have given up, not as a strategy, not as a maneuver designed to provoke a reaction or recalibrate the dynamic. Genuinely, finally, at the cellular level of someone who has exhausted their capacity to keep trying, you have let go. And the avoidant who has spent the entire relationship managing the careful distance between closeness and self-protection finds themselves suddenly, unexpectedly, standing at the edge of something they thought they controlled and discovering that the ground beneath it was never as stable as they believed. What follows is not simple. It is not linear. It is not the tidy emotional progression of a person who has access to their own interior world and the language to navigate it cleanly. It is a cascade, layered, contradictory, frequently suppressed, occasionally erupting through the surface of a composure that was never designed to withstand this particular pressure. It is, in the truest sense of the word, panic, not always visible, not always conscious, but panic nonetheless, the deep animal panic of a person who is losing something they convinced themselves they did not need, discovering too late that the convincing was never quite complete. These are the stages of that panic, mapped honestly, without softening, in the full complexity of what the avoidant actually experiences when the person they kept at arm's length finally, irrevocably, steps back. The first stage, misreading the signal. The avoidant does not immediately understand what they are sensing. This is important because the first stage of the panic is not experienced as panic at all. It is experienced as something far more manageable, far more consistent with the avoidant's existing narrative about themselves and about you. What they feel first, when your withdrawal begins to register, is a kind of confirmation, a familiar settling of something they have always half expected, the belief, encoded into their attachment system long before you arrived, that people eventually leave, that the closeness was temporary, that the warmth was borrowed and would in time be reclaimed by whoever lent it. This confirmation is almost comfortable. It fits. It slides into the pre-existing architecture of the avoidance worldview without disturbing any of the foundational beliefs they have built their emotional life upon. Of course you are pulling back. Everyone pulls back eventually. This is the nature of connection. It arrives and it recedes, and the person who never needed it too much is the person who survives the receding with their equilibrium intact. The avoidant arranges this interpretation around your withdrawal like a coat they have worn before, familiar, appropriately sized, requiring no adjustment. They continue. They function. They move through their days with the practiced composure of someone for whom this outcome was always expected and therefore cannot be called a loss. They may even feel, in this first stage, a certain vindication, a quiet private confirmation that their caution was justified, that the walls were the right choice, that people who said they would stay always eventually demonstrate that the staying was conditional. The misreading holds for a while, days, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer. The duration depends on the depth of their feeling for you and the sophistication of their capacity for self-deception. But it cannot hold indefinitely because you are not behaving the way people who leave in the way the avoidant has always expected people to leave actually behave. You are not angry. You are not reaching back out to test whether they care. You are not cycling through the familiar pattern of withdrawal and return that characterizes someone who has not yet fully let go. You are simply, and this is the thing the avoidant cannot categorize, absent. Whole in your absence, not waiting on the other side of it, just gone, in the calm and complete way of someone who has genuinely finished. And the misreading begins to crack. The second stage, the intrusion. The crack, when it comes, arrives not as a thought but as a feeling. This distinction matters enormously when understanding the avoidance experience because their relationship with feeling is so thoroughly managed, so carefully routed away from conscious experience and toward suppression that a feeling that bypasses the usual defenses and arrives directly, unannounced, uninvited, undeniable, constitutes a genuine rupture in their psychological functioning. The intrusion, as it might be called, is the moment the avoidant feels your absence rather than merely processing it intellectually as a neutral fact. It arrives in the unguarded moments, the spaces between tasks, the early morning before the mind has fully assembled its defenses, the late evening when the ordinary comforts have been exhausted, and what remains is the bare interior of a life that feels, suddenly and without adequate explanation, insufficient. In these moments, the absence does not feel like confirmation of an expected outcome. It feels like loss, specific, weighted, undeniable loss. And the feeling carries your particular signature, not the abstract loss of connection in general, but the precise, irreplaceable quality of your specific presence, your specific way of seeing them, your specific warmth that was unlike anyone else's warmth in any way that matters. The intrusion is not welcome. The avoidant does not open a door to it and invite it in and offer it the dignity of being fully felt. They do what they always do with feelings that threaten the structural integrity of their self-concept. They attempt to reroute, to redirect attention, to replace the feeling with activity or distraction or the intellectual reframing of an emotional experience into something more manageable. And to a significant extent, the rerouting works. The avoidant is extraordinarily skilled at this. They have been practicing it since childhood, developing an internal infrastructure for suppression that most people simply do not possess. But the intrusion returns. It does not accept permanent rerouting. It comes back in different moments, through different triggers, wearing different disguises, but carrying always the same essential content. Your absence. The specific gravity of it, the way it occupies a space in their interior world that their usual self-sufficiency cannot fill, no matter how many times they remind themselves that self-sufficiency was always the point. The intrusion, returning repeatedly despite their best efforts to suppress it, begins to generate something new. Something that sits underneath the avoidance composure and vibrates at a frequency that affects everything above it without being directly visible in any of it. Anxiety. The third stage, the anxiety that has no name. The avoidant does not call it anxiety about losing you. They do not name it at all if they can avoid naming it, because naming it would require a level of self-confrontation that this stage of the process does not yet make possible. What they experience instead is a generalized unease that attaches itself to the surface texture of their daily life without announcing its true source. They notice it as irritability, a lowered threshold for frustration, a quickness to impatience with circumstances and people that would not previously have disturbed their equilibrium. They notice it as a difficulty concentrating, a quality of distraction that sits behind their eyes and pulls their attention away from whatever is in front of them and toward something unspecified, somewhere internal, that does not resolve when examined and does not quiet when ignored. They notice it as a change in their relationship with solitude, the solitude that was always, previously, a chosen sanctuary, now carrying an edge of discomfort that makes it feel less like freedom and more like confinement. The anxiety moves through the avoidant's life like weather moving through a landscape, pervasive, affecting everything it touches, impossible to locate in any single source because it is not coming from any single source. It is the accumulated pressure of a grief that is not being processed, a loss that is not being acknowledged, a feeling that is not being felt. All of that unprocessed material generates pressure, and pressure that has no sanctioned outlet finds unsanctioned ones. It leaks through the seams of the avoidant's composed exterior in forms that are recognizable to anyone paying close attention, though the avoidant themselves, with the particular blind spot that characterizes people who have overinvested in the performance of self-sufficiency, is often the last to recognize what they are seeing in themselves. Underneath the anxiety, something else is beginning to form, something more specific, more directed, more urgent than the generalized unease of the second stage. The avoidance mind, circling the loss without being able to land on it directly, is beginning to move toward a question it has been avoiding since the withdrawal began. What if this is permanent? The fourth stage, the reckoning with permanence. This is the stage where the panic becomes, for the first time, genuinely conscious. Not fully, the avoidance defenses do not simply dissolve in the face of a difficult question, but conscious enough to be felt as something distinct and specific rather than as the ambient unease of the previous stage. The question of permanence, the genuine confrontation with the possibility that you are not coming back, that the withdrawal is not a phase or a maneuver or a temporary expression of pain that will eventually resolve itself in a return, lands in the avoidant's interior world with a weight that their intellectualization cannot fully cushion. Because the avoidant has, throughout the entire relationship, carried a particular assumption so deeply embedded that they never examined it as an assumption at all. The assumption that you would be there. Not necessarily in the foreground. The avoidant did not require your constant presence, did not consciously value the consistency of your availability, did not register the ongoing fact of your orientation toward them as something precious. But in the background, always in the background, a constant, reliable warmth at the periphery of their world that they had come to structure their life around without ever acknowledging the structuring. The assumption was so foundational that its removal does not initially feel like the removal of an assumption. It feels like the removal of something physical, like a shift in gravity, like the world tilting very slightly on an axis that was supposed to be fixed. The avoidant moves through this stage with the particular disorientation of someone who has lost a reference point they did not know they were navigating by, trying to recalibrate without being able to name what has changed. And in the moments when the question of permanence forces itself into conscious awareness, in the unguarded instance when the avoidant cannot maintain the distance between themselves and the truth of what they are experiencing, what surfaces is not the composed, self-contained response of someone who chose this outcome and is at peace with it. What surfaces is fear, the specific, visceral fear of someone who is beginning to understand in a way that intellectual understanding never quite captures, what it means to have lost something irreplaceable through the operation of their own hands. They did not think you would actually go. This is the raw truth beneath all of the composure and all of the self-sufficiency and all of the practiced indifference. On some level, in the deepest architecture of their attachment, they believed, they needed to believe, that you were permanent, that you would absorb whatever they could not give, that your love was the unconditional kind, the kind that does not have an end point, the kind that stays regardless of how poorly it is tended. They did not think about this consciously. but they lived as though it were true. And now the evidence is in, and the evidence says it was not true. And the avoidant is standing inside that evidence with no prepared response, because no prepared response exists for the thing you never believed you needed to prepare for. The fifth stage, the impulse toward return. What follows the reckoning with permanence is, in many ways, the most dangerous stage. Dangerous not for the avoidant, but for you. Because the panic, having finally reached a level of conscious intensity that the avoidant's ordinary suppression cannot fully manage, begins to generate action. Not the thoughtful, self-aware action of a person who has genuinely examined their patterns and arrived at a place of authentic change, but the reactive, anxiety-driven action of a nervous system that has identified a threat and is responding with the only solution available to it, the attempt to restore what was lost. The avoidant reaches out. The form varies. It might be direct, a message, a call, an appearance in your life with an energy that feels on the surface like exactly the opening you spent months wishing they would offer. It might be indirect, a gesture in the shared spaces of your world, a communication through mutual connections, a signal calibrated carefully enough to be deniable if it does not produce the desired response. It might be extraordinarily subtle, a quality of presence in peripheral spaces that makes your attention, if you notice it, feel like coincidence. But the impulse behind all of these forms is the same. The avoidant is not reaching out because they have changed. They are reaching out because the panic requires relief, and relief, to the avoidant's nervous system, means the restoration of your availability, the return of the background warmth they did not value until it was gone, the reopening of the door they pushed closed without adequate consideration of whether it would remain openable indefinitely. This is the stage at which the avoidant is at their most appealing and their most dangerous simultaneously, because they are, in this moment, genuinely feeling the things they express. The desire is real. The sense of loss is real. The warmth they offer, if they reach toward you, is real in the sense that it arises from genuine feeling rather than calculated performance. And this reality, this authenticity of the feeling, makes it extraordinarily difficult to hold the necessary distinction between feeling and capacity, between wanting to do better and being equipped to do better, between the genuine desire for your return and the genuine ability to be different once the anxiety that generated the desire has been relieved. The avoidant wants you back. They want you back with a realness that might surprise you if you witnessed it directly. But they want you back in the same way someone who has been holding their breath wants air, urgently, immediately, without the patience for the longer, harder question of why they stopped breathing in the first place and what would need to change to ensure they do not stop again. The sixth stage, the confrontation with the self. Not every avoidant reaches this stage. This must be said plainly, without false comfort, because the truth of avoidant psychology does not reliably tend toward resolution without significant internal work that most avoidants will not undertake without either extraordinary pain or external support. Many avoidants cycle through the previous stages, reach toward you or do not, and then, whether the reaching succeeds or fails, gradually allow the suppression to reassert itself. The grief goes underground again. The anxiety finds new outlets. The reckoning with permanence gets deferred into an indefinite future where it is always about to be examined and never quite is. But some avoidants, the ones whose accumulated losses have become too heavy for suppression to carry, the ones whose pain has finally outpaced their defenses, the ones who find themselves in the sixth stage with no remaining capacity to pretend it is anything other than what it is, arrive at a confrontation with themselves that changes the shape of everything that follows. The confrontation looks different for different people, but its essential content is always the same. It is the moment the avoidant sees the pattern. not intellectually. Avoidants are often capable of intellectual recognition of their patterns long before the recognition carries any emotional weight, but experientially, viscerally, with the full weight of what the pattern has cost them landing in their chest as something that cannot be breathed around, cannot be thought away, cannot be suppressed back into the ordinary background of a life that is working adequately. They see the line of people they have kept at distance, the connections they allowed to erode, the intimacies they sabotage through withdrawal and silence, and the 1,000 small acts of emotional unavailability that add up over time to a comprehensive refusal of the very thing they most deeply want. They see you specifically in this line, not as one loss among many, but as a particular weighted loss that carries more significance than the pattern usually allows itself to hold. And they feel the full dimension of what it means to have had something real and rare, and to have responded to its realness and rarity with the only tool their fear has ever given them: distance. This confrontation is not comfortable. It is not the beginning of an easy road toward change. It is, for the avoidant, one of the most painful experiences their psychology is capable of generating. The meeting of the self they have been with the self they could have been, in the specific light of a loss that made the distance between those two selves undeniable. The final stage, the grief they cannot show. What settles in the avoidant after the confrontation, whether or not it leads to genuine change, whether or not they reach toward you, whether or not they do the deeper work that the confrontation calls for, is grief. Real, thoroughgoing, private grief that they will carry with a silence that could be mistaken from the outside for recovery. It is not recovery. It is the avoidant doing the only thing they know how to do with the most significant emotional experiences of their interior life, holding it alone, in the dark, without witnesses, in the way they have held everything that ever truly mattered since long before they met you. The grief is present. It is active. It shapes the quality of their days in ways that are real even when they are invisible. It lives in the specific absence of your particular warmth, in the space that the comparison of every new person to you creates and then fails to fill, in the quiet of evenings that have changed texture permanently and will not change back. They will not show you this grief. They may never show anyone. This is not performance. It is the avoidant's deepest limitation, the foundational wound that made you loving them so costly and their losing you so consequential. You did not give up easily. You gave everything that love asks of a person, and more than it had any right to ask of you specifically. You stayed through the distances and the silences and the moments of warmth that arrived just late enough and left just early enough to keep you permanently calibrated to hope. You were generous with something precious, your time, your emotional energy, the irreplaceable years of a life that deserved to be met with equal generosity. And when you finally quietly let go, you did not break. You completed. You arrived at the end of what you were willing to give with your dignity intact and your self-knowledge deepened in the particular way that only the hardest experiences can deepen a person. The avoidance panic in all its stages is not your responsibility to resolve. Their grief is not yours to absorb. Their confrontation with themselves, if it comes, is work that belongs entirely to them, that can only be done by them, for themselves, with or without the knowledge that you are somewhere out there, living well, in the full warmth of a life no longer organized around someone else's fear. You gave up, and in the giving up, you gave yourself back. That is not a small thing. That is everything.